time for another day and new story. I thought I'd start on something a bit meatier today. So we've got Michael Morpurgo's The Amazing Story of Adolphus Tips. And to begin with, it's all about a letter. I first read Grandma's letter over 10 years ago when I was 12. It was the kind of letter you don't forget. I remember I read it over and over again to be sure I'd understood it right. Soon everyone else at home had read it too. "Well, I'm gobsmacked," my father said. "She's unbelievable," said my mother. Grandma rang up later that evening. "Booey, is that you, dear? It's Grandma here." It was Grandma who had first called me Booey. Apparently Booey was the first word she had ever heard me speak. My real name is Michael, but she's never called me that. "You've read it then?" she went on. "Yes, Grandma, I've read it. Is it true? All of it?" "Of course it is," she said, with a distant echoing chuckle. "Blame it on the cat if you like, Booey. But remember one thing, dear, only dead fish swim with the flow, and I'm not a dead fish yet, not by a long chalk." So it was true, all of it. She'd really gone and done it. I felt like whooping and cheering, like jumping up and down for joy, but everyone else still looked as if they were in a state of shock. All day, aunties and uncles and cousins had been turning up, and there'd been lots of tutting and shaking of heads and mutterings. "What does she think she's doing? And at her age? Grandpa's only been dead a few months. Barely cold in his grave." And to be fair, Grandpa had only been dead a few months, 5 months and 2 weeks to be precise. It had rained cats and dogs all through the funeral service, so loud you could hardly hear the organ sometimes. I remember some baby began crying and had to be taken out. I sat next to Grandma in the front pew, right beside the coffin. Grandma's hand was trembling, and when I looked up at her, she smiled and squeezed my arm to tell me she was all right. But I knew she wasn't, so I held her hand. Afterwards, we walked down the aisle together behind the coffin, holding on tightly to one another. Then we were standing under her umbrella by the graveside and watching them lower the coffin. The vicar's words whipped away by the wind before they could ever be heard. I remember I tried hard to feel sad, but I couldn't. And not because I didn't love Grandpa, I did. But he had been ill with multiple sclerosis for 10 years or more, and that was most of my life. So I'd never felt I'd known him that well. When I was little, he'd sit by my bed and read stories to me. Later I did the same for him. Sometimes it was all he could do to smile. In the end, when he was really bad, Grandma had to do almost everything for him. She even had to interpret what he was trying to say to me because I couldn't understand anymore. In the last few holidays I spent down at Slapton, I could see the suffering in his eyes. He hated being the way he was, and he hated me seeing the way he was too. So when I heard he died, I was sad for Grandma, of course. They'd been married for over 40 years. But in a way I felt glad it was finished, for her and for him. After the burial was over, we walked back together along the lane to the pub for the wake, Grandma still clutching my hand. I didn't feel I should say anything to her in case I disturbed her thoughts, so I left her alone. We were walking under the bridge, the pub already in sight, when she spoke at last. "He's out of it now, Booey," she said, "and out of that wheelchair too. God, how he hated that wheelchair. He'll be happy again now. You should have seen him before, Booey. You should have known him like I knew him. Strapping great fellow he was, and gentle too. Always kind. He tried to stay kind right to the end. We used to laugh in the early days. How we used to laugh. That was the worst of it in a way. He just stopped laughing a long time ago, when he first got ill. That's why I always loved having you to stay, Booey. You reminded me of how he had been when he was young. You were always laughing, just like he used to in the old days, and that made me feel good. It made Grandpa feel good too, you know. I know it did." This wasn't like Grandma at all. Normally with Grandma I was the one who did the talking. She never said much, she just listened. I'd confided in her all my life. I don't know why, but I found I could always talk to her easily, much more easily than with anyone at home. Back home, people were always busy. Whenever I talked to them, I'd feel I was interrupting something. With Grandma, I knew I had her total attention. She made me feel I was the only person in the world who mattered to her. Ever since I could remember, I'd been coming down to Slapton for my holidays, mostly on my own. Grandma's bungalow was more of a home to me than anywhere, because we'd moved house so often, too often for my liking. I'd just get used to things, settle down, make a new set of friends, and then we'd be off, on the move again. Slapton summers with Grandma were regular and reliable, and I loved the sameness of them, and Harley in particular. Grandma used to take me out in secret on Grandpa's beloved motorbike, his pride and joy, an old Harley Davidson. We called it Harley. Before Grandpa became ill, they would go out on Harley whenever they could, which wasn't often. She told me once those were the happiest times they'd had together. Now that he was too ill to take her out on Harley, she'd take me instead. We'd tell Grandpa all about it, of course, and he liked to hear exactly where we'd been, what field we'd stopped in for our picnic, and how fast we'd gone. I'd relive it for him, and he loved that, but we never told the family. It was to be our secret, Grandma said, because if anyone back home ever got to know she took me out on Harley, they'd never let me come out to stay again. She was right too. I had the impression that neither my father, her own son, nor my mother really saw eye to eye with Grandma. They always thought she was a bit stubborn, eccentric, irresponsible even. They'd be sure to think that my going out on Harley with her was far too dangerous. But it wasn't. I never felt unsafe on Harley, no matter how fast we went. The faster the better. When we got back, breathless with excitement, our faces numb from the wind, she'd always say the same thing. "Supreme, Bowie! Wasn't that just supreme?" When we weren't out on Harley, we'd go for long walks down to the beach and fly kites, and on the way back we'd watch the moorhens and coots and herons on Slapton Lea. We saw a bittern once. "Isn't that supreme?" Grandma whispered in my ear. Supreme was always her favourite word for anything she loved. For motorbikes or birds or lavender. The house always smelled of lavender. Grandma adored the smell of it, the colour of it. Her soap was always lavender, and there was a sachet in every wardrobe and chest of drawers to keep moths away, she said. Best of all, even better than clinging on to Grandma as we whizzed down the deep lanes on Harley, were the wild and windy days when the two of us would stomp noisily along the pebble beach of Slapton Sands, clutching on to one another so we didn't get blown away. We could never be gone for long, though, because of Grandpa. He was happy enough to be left on his own for a while, but only if there was sport on the television. So we would generally go off for our ride on Harley or one of our walks when there was a cricket match on, or rugby. He liked rugby best. He had been good at it himself when he was younger. Very good, Grandma said proudly. He'd even played for Devon from time to time, whenever he could get away from the farm, that is. Grandma had told me a little bit about the busy life they'd had before I was born, up on the farm. She'd taken me up there to show me, so I knew how they'd milked a herd of 60 South Devon cows, and that Grandpa had gone on working as long as he could. In the end, as his illness took hold and he couldn't go up and down stairs anymore, they'd had to sell up the farm and the animals and move into the bungalow down in Slapton village. Mostly, though, she'd want to talk about me, ask about me, and she really wanted to know too. Maybe it was because I was her only grandson. She never seemed to judge me either. So there was nothing I didn't tell her about my life at home or my friends or my worries. She never gave advice, she just listened. Once, I remember, she told me that whenever I came to stay it made her feel younger. "The older I get," she said, "the more I want to be young. That's why I love going out on Harley, and I'm going to go on being young till I drop, no matter what." I understood well enough by what she meant by no matter what. Each time I'd gone down in the last couple of years before Grandpa died, she had looked more grey and weary. I would often hear my father pleading with her to have Grandpa put into a nursing home, that she couldn't go on looking after him and on her own any longer. Sometimes the pleading sounded more like bullying to me, and I wished he'd stopped. Anyway, Grandma wouldn't hear of it. She did have a nurse who came in to bathe Grandpa each day now, but Grandma had to do the rest all by herself, and she was becoming exhausted. More and more of my walks along the beach were alone nowadays. We couldn't go out on Harley at all. She couldn't leave Grandpa even for 10 minutes without him fretting, without her worrying about him. But after Grandpa was in bed, we would either play Scrabble, which he would let me win sometimes, or we'd talk on late into the night. Or rather, I would talk and she would listen. Over the years, I reckon I must have given Grandma a running commentary on just about my entire life, from the first moment I could speak all the way through to my childhood. But now, after Grandpa's funeral, as we walked together down the road to the pub, with everyone following behind us, it was her turn to do the talking. And she was talking about herself, talking 19 to the dozen, that she'd never talked before. Suddenly, I was the listener. All right. So we'll pick up on that tomorrow, find out a little bit more. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back again tomorrow with another bit. That was Michael Morpurgo's The Amazing Story of Adolphus Tips. Alright, so take care everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.